Hello and welcome to Ethics and Moral Problems. I'm Dr. Stephen Bujno. This lecture is Ethics Undoing, Utilitarianism and Deontology. We looked briefly exactly how ethics begins with being, what a thing is. Until one determines what this is, then you can, from that point, assess exactly how to proceed ethically. The last lecture was about ethics on being, so how is it who I am? Influencing that which I do. So we looked at virtue ethics and also a natural law ethics. This is ethics on doing. So here we're not going to focus on who we are, but we're going to focus on what is being done. These are two of the classic ones. We also will look at, just briefly after this, contractualism and then principalism, particularly as that's applied in health ethics. And for those going into the healthcare field, it'll be prominent. For the rest of us, at some point we'll be a patient, so it will be worth looking at. Anyway, we live in a world where people simply do not share the same values. So it's a pluralistic world. How do we do ethics in a pluralistic world when people have different senses of what might be good, what might be right, and such? Well, utilitarian theory takes a stab at that, where what it starts to look at is not so much the motive that has put this into this place. Like, I'm not doing it because I'm a good person or because necessarily that I think this will, add to my virtuous living. I'm simply just trying to evaluate the act in itself, and I'm trying to evaluate that act in terms of a particular good. So, different ways that this can be explained or defined. This is probably the most general and least easiest to understand, is that utilitarian and consequentialism is within this. So don't be confused if I interchange those words for the sake of this lecture. It's the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So you can imagine if you had a room of individuals and you're trying to cater food for lunch or such, you might simply realize you cannot, because everybody has different taste and maybe even different medical issues that they have to be concerned about that you'll have to at least ask about. But all those things combined, you're going to say, okay, so we're going to get something that's going to be at least palatable to the majority of people. So we'll get turkey sandwiches and Italian sandwiches, something like that. Okay, the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. There are two major thinkers that are always presented with this, so we will cover them also. The first is Jeremy Bentham. He had an idea that you simply will weigh out pleasures and pains. So if you're going to try to determine what is the greatest happiness, the way that you do that is by increasing pleasures and decreasing pains. John Stuart Mill, who found that to be rather crass, said, look, some pleasures are greater than others. So we can't just compare, health with eating a really good ricotta cheesecake or something like that. Health is a good, and so is a cheesecake is a good, but what's going to come if we don't have a good diet might not be good. In other words, it may be more pain. It can't just be quantified. So if you want at least one way to understand these two, and often what I'm presenting here is more general, but I'm trying to at least give you in an encapsulated form their thinking. Jeremy Bentham would just talk about the quantities of pleasures and the quantities of pain. And John Stuart Mill would start to put some qualities to those. So there some pains way more than the pleasures. So perhaps, you would want to avoid those regardless of the pleasure they gave you. So it's not just a matter of adding up the sums. Overall, this emphasizes a self-interest. Now, remember, it's not why you're doing it, it's only what you're achieving in the end. So this end is, in philosophy, known as a goal. So the goal is the payoff. What is it that I am trying to gain? And if I can get more pleasures than pain in achieving that goal, then it's worth it. It doesn't mean that you will make no sacrifices. Sometimes short-term sacrifices pay off. So a person might even say the fact that I am in school is not exactly something that I would find pleasurable, but I realize that it's going to give me a degree and opening up my ability to get not just a successful career, but a fulfilling career. So these short-term sacrifices are worth it. They're still in my self-interest. In other words, people who try to lose weight might go on a restricted diet, realizing that there's nothing that they really like about that, the pleasures and the payoff from that. Now, there's many different varieties of this, and I'm just going to talk about three of them so that I could at least make sure that these aren't all folded into one single idea. There is a type of egoism where individuals, or it could be, groups, however a group might identify themselves, where what they are going to do is against the outside, either an individual against the group or the cohesive group against the outside society, will try to maximize their pleasures and minimize their pains. This seems sort of crass. So you can see here that the greatest number of people is interpreted by exactly either myself or the group per se. We often would denounce this. And I've said in the past that there really is no default ethic. Maybe this would be it. This is almost like an instinctual, how would you say, reaction. In other words, you walking by the counter and you see the cookie, you just simply take the cookie. It maximizes your pain. Maximizes your pleasure. Now let's add a little element to that. Perhaps there's only one cookie left and you've already had two, and your brothers had none, but you're still going to take it because that maximizes your pleasure and minimizes your pain, which you would measure at least by not having the cookie. So I think this is pretty easy to understand. I want to give a little bit of an aside here. If any of you have heard of Ayn Rand, her books Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged and such, she talks a lot about selfishness, and her view, at least the way that it'd be popularly understood if nobody looked into it, you would think selfishness lines up with egoism. Her theory is really objectivism. I'm not presenting it here as a utilitarian theory. I'm presenting it in contrast to. She, on the other hand, believes that reason has to be brought into it, and it's always virtue-driven pursuit of well-being. So it's not quite the same as what we're speaking about here as egoism, which some people will interpret as selfish, when Ayn Rand talks about her theories as selfishness, but she means it in a different way. So I just want to make sure that those two things are not conflated. Another type of utilitarian theory we can say is act consequentialism. Now, here what you're saying is that how will my group's actions provide the greatest happiness to all? Now, the distinction between this and egoism is that you're not just looking for the happiness of your group, but you're saying, you might think here of the founding fathers in the United States who understood that what we do here has to bring us the greatest amount of happiness, but it also has to bring the greatest amount of happiness for all the people that will be citizens present and future. So if they were simply egoists, they would have just lined their pockets and they would have just set themselves up to have the best life they can as long as they were living. Act consequentialism steps in and says, no, we have to consider all of the things that are outside of us too, not just what maximizes ourselves or our group's pleasures. So here, the outcome of the act determines the ethic, which is the basis of utilitarian theory. But this is a case-by-case basis of evaluating exactly what would be ethical or unethical, licit or illicit, good or bad, as a person moves into a moral evaluation. Maybe it's easier to understand act consequentialism against rule consequentialism. So this isn't trying to determine what one does, particularly in an act, but it's coming up with a rule that can be used, and then that rule then will be applied in order to achieve a utilitarian happiness for the greatest number of people. So the question is, would following whatever rule that is provided bring the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people? So whatever this moral rule is only going to be ethical, and it should only be followed if it will allow the greatest happiness. So it's more like a principle that's determined. So maybe we would say a rule might be, according to utilitarian theories, that when a person is having, let's say you're going out with friends for lunch, the one rule is that we're not going to go to any restaurant where the other one despises it. It's okay if not everybody loves what we're going to go and eat for lunch, but if somebody absolutely despises it, that would not bring the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Okay, that's a real quick run-through of utilitarian theory, which at its foundation is the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Bentham and Stewart differed on this, where Bentham held to quantity and Mill emphasized quality, but nonetheless, they both, and all utilitarians, still emphasize a particular self-interest. Egoism is a type of utilitarian theory, but one that's often criticized as crass and act consequentialism, rule consequentialism are the ones that perhaps we see the emphasis on more so when this is applied. Now, criticism for this. When it talks about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, this is talking about something that is good. There's no definition of what is good. What is good here is basically what brings the greatest happiness. So you can conceive that this could be misconstrued. It could easily be misconstrued in an egotistical utilitarian theory. But even in a rule consequence, something could be applied in a way that perhaps is not good overall. So it's just something to keep in the back of your head, that because unlike virtue theory that tries to determine, something that is connected to the human person in terms of justice or prudence, that is good for the human person and thus for society because it links to the common good, or natural law, where you're looking for some sort of primary precept or natural inclination that's good for the human person in the same way that some foods are good for the human body physiologically. Those are at least trying to discover objective goods. The criticism here is that it really doesn't. This is a little bit more democratic, which may fit our sensibilities, but doesn't always exactly tell us that this is necessarily good. This is another individual instance where you're going to see it gets difficult to become an ethical system that will, in evidence, do what it's supposed to do, the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. For instance, if you are trying to make an evaluation, whether you're doing it with Bentham, where you're just trying to weigh out the pleasures and the pains by number, or whether you're trying to determine the quality of the pleasures as opposed to the pains by Mill, you could only make this evaluation by what you know are the effects on the choices that you're making. It's impossible to know that there are going to be unforeseen effects that could be a lot worse here. For instance, it could be that this isn't by analogy, it could be that there's a new fad diet that just, perhaps there's a pill that just seems like it's very little motivation is needed. You simply have to take the pill. It doesn't require discipline of changing your diet or any such exercise, but it's shown to have at least aiding individuals in losing 10 to 15% body fat. Okay, so you take that and everything seems very good for years, and then down the line it comes to be known that this causes, say, kidney damage, irreversible or such. Okay. Now, that's just a fictional scenario, but you can imagine how many times things like this happen in all different aspects, not just in medications. Well, that was not one of the pains that got weighed into this evaluation. It was unknown. So we have no idea, except for what's happening at the moment and what knowledge we have of the moment, that we can make this determination. Here's a scenario. This is not fictional, though. For the life of me, I cannot remember exactly where I read it. There was a South American tribe that lived along the ocean, and they were fishermen. So they worked very hard throughout the day, 16 hours a day, in order to catch enough fish, not just to feed their families, but obviously to produce. That was their product that they sold outside, how they made their living. But there was a coral reef right off the shore that was being destroyed, and an environmentalist wanted this reef to be preserved. Well, you can't just simply have this group stop doing what they do for a living. So they applied a utilitarian theory here. How can we get the greatest number of happiness? In other words, can we do something that reduces the number of hours that these individuals are working? Can we still allow them to achieve the money necessary for living, if not even increase it? And also, can we find a way to preserve this coral reef? In other words, it seems like a win-win all the way around. So what they decided was they would come in and they would have these individuals become banana plantation farmers. So they would, in other words, switch from fishing to banana plantations. So they gave them all a certain amount of acreage. They showed them how to get this going. They even helped them in the transition. It increased the amount of money they were making per week, and it also decreased in the amount of hours that they needed to work in order to achieve a living. So if they were working 16 hours, now they're only working 10 hours a day. So they thought, how can this be a bad thing? So it did work for a while, but they started to notice that the reef was still being destroyed. What they weren't counting on is that this group were not capitalist. You gave them 6 free hours every single day. They thought that they were going to take those 6 hours and then somehow invest them back into their banana plantations or some other entrepreneurial endeavor. But they were quite content making more money than they did before by working less. So with their extra 6 hours a day, they were just going fishing. So what happened in the end was there still was issues with the reef. So how would you have known that? Okay, that's what I mean by incomplete evaluation. This incommensurability, this means how do you measure various pains and pleasures. So let's go back and talk about Mill here real quick about how he's determining not just the quantity of pains and pleasures, but the quality. How do you measure this? I mean, how do you measure not working longer hours to get extra money for your family to be financially more stable compared to spending time with your family as your children are young and you want to make sure that you can at least enjoy that because you can't recapture that? I mean, you can come up with your own scenarios. My point is Bentham, at least whether you agree with him or not, it was easier just to lay all those things out and just give them all as a number one. You know, you just stack how many number ones and the highest number then wins. But if you're going to pull Mill's metric here and determine it by quality, well, how are you measuring this quality? This is not easy. Just think, as a little analogy here, think when you go to the doctor with a pain or soreness and they say on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad does it hurt? You know, what is a 6? I mean, it's very difficult. I know it gives them an idea on how bad it is, but a 6 is not really a way that you can measure pain, correct? Okay, so anyway, this is just a quick run through utilitarian theory. What we want to do now, real briefly, is talk about Immanuel Kant and his deontological ethical theory. This, as opposed to consequentialism, is not focusing on what exactly is accomplished. So we're not looking at the goal or the end here. What we are only looking at here is a rule. So if you remember anything about the Enlightenment period, even though Kant comes a little earlier, he's still considered here with the Enlightenment. You had to switch from religious authority to that based on reason. So it's almost like this Copernican revolution, right? The scientific revolution. So how do you do morality if you don't have some authoritative outside, deity? Well, you're going to have to do it based on reason alone. So based on that particular instance, he starts this is where the etymology of the word comes from. Deontologos, deontology. So deon is the Greek word for duty, and logos, you should know in most things, biology, physiology, it's the science of such a thing. So Immanuel Kant, he said what we have to do, though, because we're still in a pluralistic society where people have differing values and wants and desires and needs, we have to find something universal. Otherwise, it's going to be one person imposing their rule on others. So the entire ethic is moving from the goal, which he thought is really, this is in total opposition to consequentialism, utilitarian theory. The goal is always going to be controlled by people who are at least have the greatest number or at least are in power. He wants to place it, since it's reason-based, on to the individual. So the agent, that's the moral agent, the individual actually making the determination. So what is it that they have the obligation to do and to do always? He says, first off, that morality is only for human persons. Because if you're going to base it on reason, then you can only have animals that could reason. And we could say that, there are probably some higher primates that have the ability to reason, but they don't have the ability to reason like humans do. And if we think that that's not true, keep in the back of your mind that we never hold animals guilty for something they've done. They may be put down if they can't be controlled, but that's only because we know we cannot reason with them. All right? So this requires free agency. In other words, we have to have the free will to choose. If we aren't able to choose something, well, then morality gets difficult to apply. So a reason-based individual is going to make a determination on what they may or may not choose as the good thing to do. Now, he actually has 4 categorical imperatives. I'm going to give you 2, and I'm going to just call one of them the categorical imperative. Let me say something about those 2 terms, categorical imperative. Categorical means always and universal. Okay, so think of if somebody were trying to say, you're not telling me the truth here. When you were telling me where you were, it was a lie. you may not use this term, but it would be appropriate to say, I categorically deny it. In other words, I deny it across the board without exception. An imperative is when you have to do something. So this is, what is it that you have to do, and it's always an across the board. So what he says is rather than try to have your own self-interest come to the fore here, his categorical imperative is act only from a maxim that can be willed to be a universal law. So a maxim is like a saying that something you must do. So, in other words, if you want me to, maybe it might lose some of its force, but if I can rephrase this, I would say that I can't make anybody else do anything, or I'm sorry, I can't myself say it's good for me to do this unless I can say for everybody it's okay to do this. So he's got to come up with some of these. The easiest one is harm or murder. In other words, I cannot harm or murder another person, because if I did, I'd have to will that everybody can do that, which means that other people can harm or murder me. So you can only imagine how this would break down society in a heartbeat. Another simple one is that you have to always tell the truth, because if I were to say, well, there are sometimes instances where I should lie, to get out of it, then I'm going to have to will that others can lie for whatever reasons they might feel is important. Well, then we're never going to be able to really know who is or is not telling the truth. So there, are two universals that he came up. There's others, but two universals that are easier for us to understand. Now, another categorical imperative that he held is typically called the humanity formula. In other words, you can never use another person as a means to an end. In other words, you can never use another person to get what you want. Because, remember, this is reason-based, and it brings a certain level of dignity to the individual. And you can't do anything to reduce that person's dignity. So this is just another way of saying that the reason why I cannot will something for myself unless I can universally will it is because then if I did, I'd be using the other person as a means to an end. I might want to lie just a little bit in this particular situation to get something that I want. But see, I'm using somebody else by diminishing their ability to understand the truth in order to achieve that. So that turns into a consequentialist. All of a sudden now I'm looking at the end goal. So it's very important that everything here is about the individual and the duty they have to always follow this categorical imperative. This shows up prominently in medical ethics. So when you hear the term autonomy, now we're going to look at this word autonomy when we look at principalism in another lecture. But for now, at least know that it doesn't mean that a person can do whatever they want. It's about having a respect for autonomy. So everybody's autonomy is limited. You cannot self-harm and you cannot harm other people. We can go on about this, but not now. So anyway, this, at least in medical ethics, is a direct descendant from the humanity formula of Immanuel Kant's Deontological ethical theory. All right, based on reason alone. You see, none of this comes from an authoritative deity. None of this comes from looking at exactly what's going to get us something in the end. It's only saying that this is what you should do. So it has to be about an individual who says, this is how I will live my life. Now, we're going to look at criticisms. One of these is that you notice that you can be compelled to do this by following a rule. So it doesn't always mean that a person who's doing these things is particularly nice or moral, but they are doing moral acts. So this is just trying to govern individuals' behavior in a pluralistic society. If we take this to its logical end, and I don't know if this is a good criticism, but it's at least one that can spring up. You've often heard the phrase that do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. The problem, if there isn't some good connected to the human person in that maxim, then what you're really saying is that I will do unto you whatever is okay being done to me. That's rather subjective, isn't it? Because if people do have varying values in our pluralistic society, perhaps they're perfectly fine with you, lying a little bit or taking a little bit of money, because, that's okay. I do that sometimes. So it's almost like you can come into this cooperative sense that on some things we're just not going to do this. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind as you try to understand this. The most famous criticism of this, and there are ways to work through this, we're not going to do that, I'm just presenting it here, is that because this is an imperative that you must do, and it's categorical, it's always and everywhere, there are no exceptions. So lying is universally always not to be done. There are no circumstances, whether it be a little white lie or a very serious lie. And the same thing with harming others, which would include protecting others. A famous example, and I'm actually going to put both of these against each other, because you're going to see that the lack of exceptions doesn't allow us to do some things that we would call good. And it really doesn't allow us to do some things that become good because we have two different rules that compete against each other. So the famous examples, if you were living in occupied Germany, wherever they might have been occupying, say in the 1940s, early 1940s, and Jews came to your house who were being hunted down by the Nazis seeking shelter, you'd have a categorical imperative to give them quarter, to hide them, to keep them safe, right? Because you would have to will that for yourself, so you will that for them. So you put them into the basement and you make it so that nobody can find them. And then a week later, the Germans knock on the door and they demand you to tell them the truth as to whether or not you are giving quarter or hiding any Jews in this house. Well, now what do you do? Because if you lie in this particular circumstance, then you'd have to will that others can lie in this particular circumstance. In other words, what if the Germans would lie back saying, we're not going to harm them and we're not going to take them away, we're just trying to see how many actually are still in the country. I mean, you would know that'd be deceit, but you'd have to say, well, that'd be okay for them to say that, because it's okay for me to say that I have no Jews in the house. But that if you do hold up that rule that you cannot lie, you must always tell the truth, now you've broken the rule of protecting and giving quarter to those who are in harm's way. So these competing rules, because of the lack of exceptions, wind up being one of the criticisms of the deontological theory. Now there is a little bit of a bend on this that we'll look at next time, where somebody says there might be instances of this that we could all will, but we're going to leave that for another time. So all I really wanted to talk about here, as we just got done talking about the utilitarian theory and consequentialism, is on this slide to wrap up with Immanuel Kant and see how it went from what the goal is being done to what rule is that I can come up for this. And this is even different than rule consequentialism, because rule consequentialism is still looking for something in the end result as the determiner of whether or not it's ethical. This is only, is it the maxim that I can will whatever to be a universal law, and if I can, then I will do it myself, provided I never use another human being as a means, as an end in themselves, as a means to an end. So we went from following, say, the goal to a universal moral law. So anyway, I hope this was just a clear and as a brief introduction to these two theories I call on-doing, values and pluralism, utilitarian and deontological theory. Thank you for listening.